Carter always makes me look bad because I can't speak walking around, and if I did, I'd make you dizzy. So I'm gonna refer to some notes here. First of all, try and keep this to a fairly short period of time in the sense that I'll leave some time for questions at the end. Dr. Thomas Boss, thanks for the introduction. It was kind. I wish my mom could have been here. She would have really been excited and impressed about that. I got to thank Dr. Barrett for inviting me to come and be a part of this. When I heard that he wanted me to talk about moral virtue and moral injury, I thought he wanted me to talk about my time as the money guy at the Pentagon. And General Miller and I and General Schmidl, before, we've all sort of lived, and that's moral virtue and moral injury at its best and worst, and I won't tell you which place falls where, but no, he wanted me to actually talk about something else, so I'm going to do that. But before I get on to the discussion today, I do have two other people I want to thank. I want to thank Karen Ornberg, and I want to thank Sarah White, because those two ladies over there, you know, stuff like this doesn't just happen. And I say this really for the midshipmen, because you just walked in, there was food, you got a place, and life's good, everything's set up. Guess what? That just does not happen. It doesn't happen as seamlessly as it's happened for this. So how about a round of applause for those two? What Dr. Thomas meant to say when he introduced me as, you know, being sort of the grassroots guy was, I am far and away probably the least educated speaker that's going to speak here. I looked through all the bios. I'm pretty confident that I'm the least educated speaker. But what I hope to bring to you is sort of a grassroots, a ground view of these two topics, why I think they matter, how I think they're interconnected, and then to share with you some personal experiences of both moral virtue and moral injury. I spent a little over 39 years as a Marine. I spent 34 months in Iraq in combat. So what you're about to hear, I will tell you, is hugely tainted. I think we're all prisoners of our education and our experience, and I'm certainly tainted by that. But that's going to be the grounds that I use to talk about this. You know, in the scientific world, there's not a lot of evidence base of what I'm going to tell you, but I'm going to tell you I've seen it up close, I've seen it personal, and hopefully it will generate more conversation. As the superintendent said, as Admiral Carter said, I hope this doesn't stop at the end of tomorrow, but really energizes some thought about those of you who have an ability to look deeply into these two subjects that I'm actually personally very passionate about. I titled my remarks, Character, Body Armor for Modern Warfare. I did that intentionally. If you can't figure it out by the end, I will have failed miserably. But I did that once again to sort of take this out of the realm of the theoretical. I will reference some folks who have impacted my ability to look into these topics over time. But at the same time, I want you to take out of it sort of some real world practical things. I'm going to talk about moral virtue, if you will, about character, about why character matters. I think character has an impact on moral injury, and I use character as sort of the embodiment of moral virtue, if you will. I'll give you a better explanation of that as we go along, but I think there is a direct correlation, there has been in my life, of how moral character, but more importantly, how leaders of moral character make a difference in the lives of people who encounter moral injury. This is not a topic that's exclusive to the military. That's going to be my reference. If you've read any headlines lately, you know that character matters around the world. It matters and is indispensable, I would offer, for athletes, educators, business leaders, politicians, actors, parents, I guess, lately, in college scandals. But it is essential. It is central to the warrior. And that's the piece I want to sort of transmit to you, is that every one of these young men and women who's wearing service dress blues from the Naval Academy today, and everybody who wears the cloth of their nation as a commissioned officer that's here today, has signed on to a warrior ethos. When they joined, when they signed on the dotted line to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, they signed into a warrior culture. They didn't know it perhaps at the time. Some of those in the room may not know it now, although if they've heard me speak it, I've already told them. So if they still don't know it, I'm failing on 2 accounts, at least. But it is a warrior culture that we are a part of. Those who wear the uniform, those who, my friends who are here who are now wearing suits who did it then, but you sort of don't ever pull away totally from that culture. Service in the military today demands a life dedicated to that warrior ethos and spirit, a life committed to the ideals of the warrior spirit. What we're going to talk about in sort of the framework of this is what character is from my perspective, why it matters, why it's important, a little bit about how you develop it, and then we're going to move on and talk about how leaders with character and how character impacts moral injury. I think everything has to start with a definition, so I'm going to start with the definition that Aristotle is, I think there's no better place to start than that. So Aristotle's sort of definition of moral virtue is a disposition to behave in the right manner and as a mean between extremes of deficiency and excess, which are vices. We learn moral virtue primarily through habit and practice rather than through reasoning and instruction. Those are the words of Aristotle. As you hear me talk through the rest of the day, you will find that my sort of concept for this whole idea of building character falls exactly in line with that, whether you agree with it or disagree. And oh, by the way, I didn't know that that was the definition of moral virtue before I started putting together my idea of character and its importance for warrior leaders. So I guess even the blind hog can find an acorn once in a while. And I was definitely the blind hog there. You see, I believe that character is the manifestation of moral virtue. Going back to that definition of Aristotle's, I think character is moral virtue in action, right? He talked about practicing, about it being a habit. And I think that's the critical piece. Abraham Lincoln said, character is like a tree and reputation like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of it. The tree is the real thing. Character is the real thing. Oliver Goldsmith said you can preach a better sermon with your life than with your lips. I offer that to my chaplain friends because I think every officer who has a responsibility should understand that you teach in your actions better than your words. Napoleon said character is victory organized. And Woodrow T. Wilson, a president, said character is a byproduct. It is produced in the great manufacture of daily duty. And that's a concept that I want to drive home, that it is this daily requirement. Vice Admiral Carter mentioned sort of that daily resetting of your moral compass. We were privileged to have here at the Naval Academy Leadership Conference General Pace, who I think is one of the most amazing men who's ever led in uniform. And he said he resets his moral compass daily. If somebody that's as accomplished as him does it, then I think there's some grounds there. Whether there is evidence-based research that proves it, that's another thing. See, the commonality in all of these quotes is this, and the commonality of the quotes is that character is something of substance. It's tangible. It's actions, not words. It's a way of life. It's something that is lived and achieved, not something that is simply talked about. Each of these quotes reinforces that those that would have character must in fact walk the walk, not simply talk the talk about what they consider their moral virtues. Brene Brown, in her book, Daring to Lead, talks about living your values, about identifying your values, but then living them, not just identifying them, not just saying, these are my values, but simply by walking around. If you were to ask a Marine what's the greatest compliment they could get, it would be that you're in the airport and somebody walks up to you and says, hey, I think you're a Marine. And you go, yes, I am. How did you know? And they said, well, it's just the way you act. That's what it means. But to be a person, a woman or a man of character, I think has those very same rewards, that people see you as a person of character. It's like fitness. It's not like a hairstyle. You don't put it on. You don't change it. You work at it every day. Character is the tree, not the shadow. The life lived, not the lips moved. It's the victory achieved through organized pursuit and the commitment to daily duty. In short, it's tangible. Character matters because it defines not only individual success, but character defines the success between the leader and the led. Character defines the true success of that organization. And in my experience, character defines success in even the harshest environment. And from my experience, the harshest environment is that of combat, where people's lives depend on people acting as women and men of character. Character is something that has defined successful leaders, I would offer, since the beginning of time. Heraclitus stated, "Our character is our destiny." Think about that. Especially for the midshipmen out there, but for all of us, think about that. Your character is your destiny. Ask yourself, what is your character today? Is that what you will become? Is that where you are going? Is that where you want to go? Did you punch the wrong address into your GPS? You got time to change the address. You got time to pick the best route. Dial up waves. There's time. But you see, for the military professional, regardless of rank or position, character is really about accountability. It's about holding yourself accountable. It's about holding others accountable. It's certainly about accountability in crisis, but I would offer it's more about accountability in your day-to-day life. Living your values. It's accountability for the past, it's accountability for the present, and it's accountability for the future. It's holding people accountable to a standard of professionalism, holding them accountable to being men and women of character. You see, the standard that is walked past, especially when matters of character, the standard that you walk past is the standard that you accept. And accepting anything less than complete moral virtue is unacceptable, and especially for the warrior. I've been blessed to live and work with great men of character in my life. Great men of great moral virtue. It started with my dad. My dad was a World War II, Korea, and Vietnam veteran. He left high school to join the Marine Corps, but his living a life of moral character started well before that. He retired as a Sergeant Major of Marines after his second tour in Vietnam. Considering some of the other great folks I've had the privilege to work with, I look back on my dad, who had a GED. He left high school and never went back. He started his own business, was a successful businessman. He could build anything and make anything. In fact, he designed the first brushless car wash in retirement. I wish he would have patented it. But you see, he was a man of character, and to him it didn't matter. The patent wasn't important. It wasn't about the money. It was about delivering a better product to the people in the 5-state area of Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, where car washes are important because your car dissolves before your very eyes. But I've had the privilege to work with great leaders like President George Herbert Walker Bush. I got to serve our past Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mattis. I got to serve the Deputy Secretary of Defense and twice Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England. So to put my dad ahead of all those people is something, but here's why. When he was 13 years old, his dad passed away. He tried to run a farm in Nebraska for 2 years as a 13-year-old because he was the oldest boy. 2 years later, his mom realized they couldn't do it. They moved. He got a job in a Pabst Blue Ribbon brewery. He was destined to be a Marine. He worked in that brewery till he left the brewery and joined the Marine Corps, and his first combat action was in the Battle of Okinawa, where he was awarded the Silver Star as a private first class, age 18. He landed with about 200 Marines in the Battle of Okinawa on April 1st, 1945. On May 17th, 1945, a day in our family we like to reflect as the day we were all born, In May 17, 1945, approximately 188 Marines began to attempt to take this hill called Sugarloaf Hill, a critical piece of terrain in the Battle of Okinawa. By day's end, they had actually taken that hill 3 times. They had to leave the hill because they were out of ammunition. At the end of the day, they had taken 160 casualties. There were only 28 Marines who were still capable of remaining in their fighting positions. My father was one of them. That significantly impacted his life. I know now that he suffered moral injury to see 160 of his fellow Marines leave the battlefield. Not all killed, but all that would actually never return, because to be wounded, to get a Purple Heart in World War II, you had to go to the battalion aid station where somebody certified that you were wounded. My father was actually shot through the calf and had suffered fragmentation wounds. He was wounded, but not officially wounded. And yet, that never bothered him because it wasn't about him. But I would tell you this, the great leaders I've encountered, my father, those other great men that I've mentioned, pale in comparison to the other great leaders that I've served alongside, the young men and women over 39 years who were amazing leaders of character. Sergeants major and command master chiefs, sergeants, corporals. I'll tell a couple of stories today. But what they did for me over 39 years was they helped me to build that body armor. They helped me to be able to see what character meant, why character mattered, and how people of character made a difference. What I saw in their lives was an example that none of us can do it alone. That you don't build your character individually. You build it as part of a culture. You build it by an association. In different ways, some of these next quotes talk to why it matters in a way that I will never be so eloquent. Charles de Gaulle said, faced with crisis, the man of character falls back upon himself. I would change that just a little bit. In the book On Combat, there's a quote about meeting that moment where your character matters. And it says, you do not rise to the occasion, but you fall to the level of your training. I would offer to change that even a little further. You do not rise to the occasion, you fall to the level of character that you pursue. Much to Admiral Carter's point, where they were fully capable of shooting a missile, but didn't. Why? Because they were men of character, and they understood they didn't need to take a life. Abraham Lincoln said, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. A true test of your character and why it matters. And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe said, you can easily judge the character of a man by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. And that's where I think we see the real power of character. Secretary England simplified that. Secretary England, who came and spoke at the Naval Academy Leadership Conference, said this. He said, being a man of ethical behavior is simple. Follow one rule, never embarrass your mother. Most of you will forget everything I said. You probably won't forget that I said never embarrass your mother. That's why character is important. That's what character is. So how do you build your character? And I would offer you build it in 3 different ways. You build it through choice, you build it through challenge, and you build it through camaraderie. And by camaraderie, I don't mean sort of the standard thing of just people being together and having a common vision and a common goal. No, I talk about it as much deeper than that. I talk it about, in my mind, camaraderie is the love of your comrade, the love of the people you lead. Love not necessarily as an emotion, but love as an action of being willing to sacrifice everything in your life for the success of others. Towards the end of my time in Iraq in July of 2009, a young Lance Corporal by the name of Brandon Lara was out on a routine patrol on his way out to the western reaches of Anbar province, out towards Al-Qaim, a place that you've actually heard about. It's the border crossing that goes into Syria. And he was on his way out there, and he he and the other 3 vehicles, he was a turret gunner, and they were moving through this small town called Rawa, and an insurgent came around from the corner of a building, got into a crowd, pulled the pin on an armor-piercing hand grenade and threw it at Lance Corporal Lara. And Lance Corporal Lara, who was armed with a .50 caliber machine gun, and very much like Admiral Carter, had all the approvals in the rules of engagement simply to engage this insurgent with a .50 caliber machine gun, because that's what was mounted on his vehicle. But he chose not to do that. Because you see, in his mind, he knew that the very real potential was he was going to innocently kill or injure Iraqi civilians, the very people we were trying at that point and had been successful in coming to believe that our cause was the right cause, that our moral character was overcoming the lack of moral character of Al-Qaeda. And in that moment where he made that decision, he went back down in the turret and pulled out his M4 and was able to squeeze off 2 perfectly aimed rounds and dispatch the insurgent. But as he squeezed off that final round, the grenade exploded, not inside the turret, outside. And on July 19th of 2009, Lance Corporal Lara lost his life, saving the lives of countless Iraqi civilians who he knew not, who he didn't even speak their language, who he did not share a religion with. But he knew that if he didn't kill that insurgent would probably come back and try and kill him or his friends or other Marines later on. And he did it with a purpose. And the purpose was he was living the elements of the warrior ethos. He had, obviously, great courage. And there's no doubt about his courage. He had great honor. He had great integrity. He was definitely selfless. And he was loyal not only to his fellow Marines, but loyal to that great cause that we were trying to fight at the time. You see, by building those elements of the warrior ethos, Lance Corporal Lara had a different kind of body armor that day. When you wear that body armor, you wear it in many different conditions. And he wore it in the most miserable, his real body armor. It was only about 130 degrees that day. But how much more uncomfortable is your moral body armor to wear sometimes? And what a great example he was of that. It's been mentioned, building character is a commitment to a daily struggle. That commitment starts with choice. In the words again of Heraclitus, choosing what to do, what to think, and by doing so, choosing what you become, punching the right address into that GPS of your moral character. My experience, and the experience of great men and women of character that I've served alongside, has also proven another point, a point attributed to Helen Keller, which says, you don't build character in ease and quiet. You build character in times of challenge. This doesn't mean exclusively facing tough challenges that demand physical courage or deprivation or exposure. It doesn't mean being Lance Corporal Lara, but it means sometimes taking on those very difficult challenges that demand simple mental and moral courage in the moment to not walk past the standard, to hold yourself accountable, to do what is right even when no one is looking. And finally, it's not exclusively about hardship and austerity, but that third point and most critical step in building character is built through love of your comrade. David Brooks said, character is built not only through austerity and hardship, but is also built sweetly through love. When you have deep friendships with good people, you copy and then absorb some of their best traits. When you love a person deeply, you want to serve them and earn their regard. You see, and I would offer this, when you're in a warrior culture, it's not just about that person, but you want to serve that culture and all that the culture stands for, all the good that the culture stands for. You do this not to be popular, but rather to be revered, revered for your character, not for who you are, not for being someone, but for being something. And that something is being a woman or a man of character. You want to be revered for your character, not feared for your lack of it. So those are the key elements: character, and how you build it. Choice, challenge, and camaraderie. Put that back in the back and ask yourself every day, what are you doing? How are you working on building through your choices, through the challenges you put yourself in, and through your camaraderie? The long road to moral virtue and individual character begins with an accurate understanding of our own nature. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant said, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made." David Brooks goes on in his book, The Road to Character, to say, he develops this thing called the crooked timber tradition, but a fundamental part of that, he talks about that tradition holds that we basically have to understand that we all have weaknesses, that we need to confront our limitations and our weaknesses, that we have the power to hold ourselves and others accountable to understand their weaknesses. The strongest thing I think you have in understanding your weaknesses and to challenging them is to be a man or woman who is humble. To truly understand the accurate nature of who you are and where our character is, you must be humble. C.S. Lewis, I think, has my favorite definition, the one I use all the time for humility. He says, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. I think there can be no greater challenge to any leader than to take on that idea of humility. And when you can do that, you identify your weaknesses. Nobody puts on a set of body armor, and those of you who've ever worn it know it's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit right. But after a while, it becomes second nature. You don't put it on and go for a 10-mile hike. You get used to it over time. And I would offer that if you're a woman or a man who is humble, you can see that, and you can build those fibers of character just like you do build the fiber of muscle slowly and over time. You do that because the things that lead us astray, lust, fear, vanity, gluttony, what the warrior ethos defines as the inward vices of laziness, envy, greed, selfishness, dishonesty, and the indiscriminate harming of others, those things are all temporary, but character is permanent. That idea of courage, honor, integrity, selflessness, and loyalty, those last. Legendary basketball coach John Wooden said, be more concerned with your character than your reputation, because your character is what you really are, while your reputation is merely what others think you are. Build those fibers of character. Defeat those inward vices, and do it daily. The struggle against weakness requires habits of self-effacement, reticence, modesty, obedience. But I would offer obedience to some larger thing, a capacity for reverence and an admiration of something that is larger than ourselves. I think it's interesting that the root of the word obedience doesn't necessarily mean the blind following of guidance. The root of the word obedience means to listen intently. And as a leader, I think we must listen intently to our own selves and where we are. But we also have to listen intently to those we lead, and we have to listen intently to those that lead us. Because being a leader means not only leading those you have positional authority for, but it's this tough thing called peer leadership, of leading those that you have no authority over other than moral authority. They must believe that what you are doing is right. And then ultimately you must lead your seniors. Because if you have that moral authority over your peers, you will display a level of character that will lead and hold accountable those that lead you. Finally, no good life is possible unless it's organized around a vocation. A vocation of military service is truly different. It's truly different because it puts you in a different place. It puts you in a different place because It gives you a framework within to operate that allows you to drive to success. We said that character's not built in the quiet. That's certainly a fact. Your character is challenged when you least expect it. Your character is challenged when you're tired, or when you're under pressure, when you're under stress, or you're weakened by the impact of the moment, or maybe when final exams are there. Your character is tested in the moment, but it is even more tested in the moment in combat, because combat by its very nature presents these moments that will test you. Combat is defined by the very factors that challenge our character. The nature of war is one that is going to challenge your character. Character is defined by friction and uncertainty, by fluidity and disorder, by complexity, by various human dimensions, by violence and danger, and the simultaneous combination of physical, moral, and mental forces. That's what combat's about. That's what that moment of time was for Lance Corporal Lara. All of those things coming into a very clear picture, challenging his moral authority, not having time to fall back. And I would offer that the modern battlefield, the battlefield that will be fought by those midshipmen present today, and was slightly touched on by some of us who've recently left active duty, the decision space is greatly reduced by the technologies that we are fielding to confront great power competition. Uncertainty, there's nothing in war that's predictable. You have uncertainties about the enemy. You have uncertainties about your enemy. You have uncertainty about yourself. Strong character, however, will reduce the uncertainty. Uncertainty causes us to take risk and accept chance, but you want that taking risk and accepting chance, that Lance Corporal Lara, to do it within a framework that you do it for the right reasons of character. Fluidity. Each episode in combat is temporary, just like many in our lives. It combines with the event that happened before and the event that happened after, and it continues to paint a picture of things that are very different in our lives. Character, however, can provide you some stability in that constantly changing, fluid environment. If you have a central, visceral idea of who you are as a leader and why being a leader of character matters, it gives you a sense. And when you're fighting in 5 dimensions, fluidity rapidly combined with friction leads to disorder. 5 dimensions of air, sea, land, space, and cyberspace. It heightens the disorder. Character brings a sense of order to situations that can very easily spiral into disorder. Complexity, there is no action in combat that comes from a single decision. They're the result and interaction of complex systems. The most complex system on the battlefield is the human. That shared sense of character reduces the complexity for both the leader and the led. Then there's the human dimension. Solid character can reduce the complexities, the inconsistencies, the peculiarities. Understanding your enemy's character or lack thereof similarly shapes your understanding of the human dimension. Danger, fear, privation, and exhaustion all impact moral and physical strength and stamina. Those affect the human dimension. Violence and danger I probably don't need to go into, but I would tell you this about violence on the battlefield. It's not violence as most people think about it. War has been defined as force applied in organized violence, but the violence is not the outward manifestation of aggression, but rather, I would offer the controlled application of force, tempered by the character of the warrior. And I would hold up Lance Corporal Lara as an example. As a leader, you must understand fear, because fear is central to understanding courage. The Spartans felt that the opposite of fear was love. I would offer that courage is fundamental output of love. People are courageous because they love other people. And the physical, moral, and mental forces, you can measure the physical, the moral, and the mental are difficult, but if you can harness the moral and the mental, you will see outcomes in combat that are unbelievable. So how does all this go to moral injury? How does it affect moral injury? There are many definitions of moral injury. Vice Admiral Carter gave Jonathan Shay's. I actually like that one because it's simple and I'm a Marine, and the shorter the better. I won't go back over what that was. Believe it or not, the Department of Veterans Affairs has a definition of moral injury. And as only the Department of Veterans Affairs could be, it's 2 paragraphs long. It's really hard. And I hardly understood it when I read it. It's important to understand, though, that there's also another side to moral injury, and it's sort of a byproduct or a potential byproduct of living in a military culture, because, and this definition comes from Brett Litz, which says moral injury is perpetrating, failure to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. Making immoral decisions on the battlefield. Making immoral decisions not on the battlefield. You see, this expands that definition basically not only of being exposed to these things, but includes being part of and failing to prevent those acts that transgress beliefs and expectations. There's no doubt that combat is full of acts that shatter moral and ethical expectations. But I would offer those can occur anywhere. I'll give my personal example. My first exposure to combat-related moral injury was in 2003, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. What I'm going to walk you through first is my first exposure to moral injury, my personal exposure to moral injury, and that was in 1998. I had just finished battalion command. I was selected to go to spend a year studying foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. I was somebody. My youngest son was born with Down syndrome. He'd been through some hellacious first year of his life. But he was recovering. He'd had 2 open heart surgeries. He had a pacemaker. But things were looking good. But I was done with command, and it was time to move on. And not only did I have to move, but my son had to get another pediatric cardiologist to take care of him as he grew up. So I had to go to Washington, D.C., and oh, by the way, we had to get another house. And oh, by the way, if you've ever been in Washington, D.C., there's no government housing available, so you got to go find one. And so the whole family gets to go. And by the way, we have an appointment for my son to meet his new pediatric cardiologist. And I go through this almost week of training, and my wife's up looking for a house, and we sort of find a house, and we go to meet the pediatric cardiologist. And while we're there, my son takes a turn for the worse. And by the middle of the day, things aren't looking really good. And by that night, they're going to try and admit him to the neonatal intensive care, except that at Bethesda, there's no room for my son. So we're sent to DC Children's Hospital, which is a great hospital, but it isn't my hospital. It isn't where my Navy medicine takes care of me. It isn't where my institution puts their arm around me and says, and oh, by the way, it isn't where any chaplains happen to be that maybe somebody I could talk to. And my son has a really bad Friday. But Saturday, he starts to get a little bit better. And it's been a long 48 hours for my wife and I, and we go back to our kids, and we get a night's sleep, and we go to Mass on Sunday morning, and we call and say, how are things? And they say, hey, they're not too bad. A little turn for the worse over the night, but things are still going pretty good. And by the time we get to the hospital, they won't even let us see our son because there's so many people trying to work on him. And at 1 o'clock that afternoon, he died. And I felt like the entire institution, that I had grown up with at that point, that I had served for 20 years, had abandoned me and my family. That this idea of taking care of each other was just talk. It was lips moved, not actions. And then I had to go back and take my son back to North Carolina because that's where my household goods were. And then I had to PCS. I had to pack it up. And in the midst of all that, there was a hurricane that had to stop the middle of the move process. And we showed up and we all went our different ways. And then I started getting bills from DC Children's Hospital that said, if you don't pay us immediately, we're going to take you to a collections agency. And I felt even more abandoned. And then we got the topper of all toppers. We got the, hey, how's your son doing? From DC Children's Hospital. Of course, I wasn't home to open that up out of the mailbox. Who was there to do that? My wife. So I have a sense of what this moral injury thing is. Those expectations, those things that mattered in my life. But there were some great people that came and helped me through this time. Some chaplains, some fellow Marines, women and men of character who explained to me that this wasn't an abandonment as I saw it. And there just wasn't room, and they weren't going to kick somebody else out at Bethesda, and it just happens. So I lived through that. And I went on to Iraq later on. And in 2003, a great young corporal by the name of Armando Gonzalez was killed. Armando Gonzalez was one of the best truck drivers in the outfit I had. We were doing long line haul support to 1MEF as we were marching north, and these young men and women would be out for 72 hours at a time. And we didn't have enough refuelers of our own. We actually had to rent refueling trucks to support the fight. And Armando Gonzalez volunteered to drive one of these trucks. And they were stopped, and some of his Marines decided they were going to get underneath the trailer, and he shooed them away from there, and he was sitting off to the side, and this trailer collapsed because it wasn't a really great trailer. And as it collapsed and slid sideways, it cut Armando Gonzalez in half, and he lost his life. He was soon to be a father, a daughter that he's never seen. And once again, I felt betrayed by an institution that couldn't even provide the things for people to fight the way they needed to fight. And this had been an issue since I was a young major, and one that we had talked about, and and it just came, all that issue of the institution failing me came back again with Armando Gonzalez. And then I talked to his wife, who was one of the most amazing women of character. When we got back, I called her and I expressed again my sincere condolences that I'd done in a letter, but it's tough to write anything in a letter that means anything. And she said, Colonel, I was a colonel at the time, she said, Colonel, I appreciate everything you said, but I know my husband gave his life doing the thing he loved, being a Marine. Going back to that idea of that institution and the thing you love, and her ability to understand that helped me through that idea that I'd been abandoned. And more Marines over the course of my time, provisional mortuary affairs Marines who had to deal with the most heinous part of combat, picking up deceased members of the military services. And it's one thing if you're trained, but we didn't really have these people properly trained because we just didn't have enough units to do that. And to see the anguish in their faces was difficult. We took a truck company, one of my truck companies, not while I was deployed. The way operations in Iraq worked, East Coast guys would send things to West Coast units, and we were a big mishmash in the battlefield. But one of my companies, who I visited right before I was ready to go back to Iraq in 2005, had been assigned as a provisional mortuary affairs company. And their mission, after the second Battle of Fallujah, was to go through Fallujah and to pick up all of the remaining bodies in Fallujah. We had obviously taken all of our dead bodies out. The Iraqi soldiers had taken theirs. But these were everybody else. These were those who had been tortured to death by Al-Qaeda. These were some of the most unfortunate people on the planet. And our Marines were unfortunate in that they had to witness this absolute lack of humanity there were 89 of them that went on this mission. They lived in Fallujah in a place called the Potato Factory. Of those 89, 39 could never deploy again because of what they saw. Part of it was post-traumatic stress, but part of it was moral injury. It wasn't what they signed up for. They felt that the leadership had failed them. And then the last one for me is in 2005. A mass casualty has happened. Marines are injured. Some of my Marines are coming into the surgical shock trauma platoon. I'm in there checking on them, checking on other wounded. And in comes a father, an uncle, and a young Iraqi boy. The Iraqi boy, 7 years old, with a chunk of metal in his abdomen as big as my fist, who just happened to be driving past when this IED went off, intended to kill U.S. service members. And as his uncle went to help him, he was shot. His uncle's laying on the operating table with the expended round literally barely penetrating the sac of his heart, but he's still alive. And I thought, how could we do this to these people? Most people don't realize how kinetic Iraq was in 2000. It's almost the forgotten period of Iraq. The awakening and on was good. Everything before 2004 was the first part, but that middle part was still, we were working our way up from being, tops on the enemy list, trying to work our way down. And I'm saying, I don't know that we're having any success. But I'll tell you what, the father, an Iraqi that I didn't know, was a man of character. 4 months later, there was a phone call that said, sir, you need to come down to the entry control point because there's an Iraqi gentleman here that demands that he sees you and he's not going to leave. And he's got a young son and I don't know if he should be here, but you need to come. And I couldn't figure out who it was, but I went down there and it was that same young boy. And it was the father, and all he said was, thank you. He said, Al-Qaeda would have left us to die on the side of the street, but you chose to save us. You are good men. Allah will protect you. Pretty impressive display of character by somebody who was killed by an action that, had we not been there, may or may not have happened. But it got me through that bit of moral injury. My history is not unique. Throughout history, leaders have made the difference. I'll wrap up with a quote from Heraclitus in 500 BC. He said, for every 100 you send us, 10 should not be here. 80 are targets, 9 are warriors, and thanks to them, we will have a battle. But one of them is a leader, and he will bring the others back. I would like to paraphrase that today. I would paraphrase it this way. One of them is a warrior leader of character, and he or she will bring the others back from the moral injury that they will suffer. You see, character matters. Whether it's the character of a caregiver and a chaplain or a doctor or a fellow Marine or sailor or soldier or airman or somebody in that culture, leaders matter. Men and women of character will bring the others back. They will bring them back from the debilitating injury. They will return them to warfighting readiness. They will repair those shattered ideals and restore the shattered confidence that is moral injury. And they do it because it is who they are and what they do, not what they are called and not the jobs they hold. These are the ones that make a difference. These are the ones that are the body armor. They're body armor for themselves, and they are body armor for those they lead. And they are body armor for modern conflict. So with that, I'll close. We've got a little bit of time for questions. Thanks for being here today, but more importantly, thanks for your interest and your excitement and your investigation of this unbelievably important topic of moral virtue and moral character. When a politician does that, he means keep going, but I actually meant stop. Go ahead. Any questions? Anybody? Midshipman, come on. Be brave.
Morning, Joe. Roger Herbert.
Yeah, Roger.
Academy. Thank you for sharing that story about Lance Corporal Laura. I wonder when I hear stories like that if Lance Corporal Laura learned something in the Marine Corps that allowed him to make to have those virtues of courage and compassion, or if he came to the Marine Corps with that. And I'm kind of thinking about our students who are about to enter into that very complex battlefield, and if it is something that can be learned, what should they be doing right now to maybe increase the chances that when they're confronted with something like that, they make that amazing choice that Lance Corporal Laura made. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I firmly believe you can make people character. I hearken back to my first platoon. First platoon I commanded had 3 convicted felons in it. It was a different time in the 1970s. All were for violent crimes, attempted murder, armed robbery. Of those 3 young men, one is doing a life sentence in the New Hampshire State Penitentiary for being a drug dealer. The other 2 are amazingly successful businessmen who left the Marine Corps, but left the Marine Corps as men of character and followed and became, and I've kept in touch with most all of those youngsters we were all youngsters together, but I was sort of the oldest youngster. So that's my personal example at the very front end of, yes, you can make a difference. You can build character. I would offer to the midshipmen here, it starts very simply. You know, there's the Chinese saying that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. I would just say, when you wake up every morning, you say, I am not going to walk past a standard today. Hold yourself accountable. Hold your fellow midshipmen accountable for the standards of professionalism that are expected of you here today. And I think we can all do that in our various professions, of not letting unethical, immoral actions take place. We let people wrong each other all the time. Some of us just don't want to get involved. And I don't say that collectively to the audience, but I say to the broader country. It's how we get where we get. Because when you don't engage, things do get worse, and then they become harder to solve. So I would say for the midshipmen, just do the simple thing. Simple stuff like walking through the yard and seeing somebody who, should introduce their shoes to a can of shoe polish, I mean, an amazing relationship will build, right? No, but I use that as a small example. But how many times have you walked past it? How many times for the rest of the room have you let somebody do or say something where you knew it was wrong, you felt it was wrong, and you didn't? And to say or to correct something, you don't have to crush their spirit. I use an example of General Mattis. I was a young lieutenant. We were doing an operation, and he came over to visit me, and he asked me how I was doing, and I told him I was cold. We were in Korea. It was February. We just come from Hawaii. I mean, it was cold. So he asked me how my Marines were doing. I told him they were doing fine. I showed him the laydown. We walked around an hour and a half, 2 hours. Classic, then Captain Mattis in every fighting hole. We got back, and the only thing, he said 2 things. He said, hey, John, Marines, they understand the mission. They're ready to go. You got them all set up right? And then he said, how are you doing? You still cold? I said, no, sir. And he just walked over the hill. And I thought, that guy just chewed my ass. Just stop thinking about yourself. Start thinking about your Marines. Get out there and do the things you need to do as a leader, and you're not going to be cold, you knucklehead. Now, those would have been my words, right? That would have crushed the spirit of Lieutenant Wissler. My spirit wasn't crushed. That was a powerful way to hold me accountable, right? So that's what I'm saying. Just, use something as funny as, hey, when you get back to your room, introduce your shoe polish to your shoes, They'll think it's funny, maybe. No, that's what I would, this is a small thing. Start with the small things.
I found it very moving that individuals came and helped you heal your moral injury, and you gave examples of some of the people of character who played a role in that. But I'm wondering, did you ever feel that the institutions did any of that? It sounds like people did, but did the institutions?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. After my son died, And, you know, first of all, nobody should be a part of that club. I'll just say that right up front. So we're back, we're trying to plan the funeral. I get a phone call from the senior aide to the commandant, and he says, have you got time to talk to the commandant? And I was like, what am I gonna say? No, I'm really busy? Sure, I got time to talk to the commandant. General Krulak got on the phone and said, John, I'm really sorry to hear about the loss of your son. It's commandant of the Marine Corps. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nobody down at Camp Lejeune. I mean, seriously, I'm one of hundreds of battalion commanders and squadron commanders, and I don't think much more about that. And then later on, this institution called the Marine Corps Law Enforcement Foundation calls up and says, I need your kids' social security numbers. And I said, I don't give social security. And they said, we want to give each of your kids an education bond because we know you've lost a son, and we know that that's, and I found out later that General Krulak had provided my information to them. So did the institution take care of me? No, they threw their arms around me. They hadn't abandoned me. As I look back on it, they never could have prevented that. That was some, but that's not how I felt at the time, right? That's not, that moral injury occurs. And that's sort of my piece of moral injury is it doesn't really matter if it's intentional or unintentional. It happens. It, like the challenges to your character, those issues of moral injury come at you when you're least prepared, when you're tired, when you're stressed, when all of that spirals down at one point. But those people of character stand up and make a difference. So yeah, the institution did. And later on, you know, we had a Marine this young Marine that I just thought the world of, who burned to death in a Humvee, and we had no fire suppression in Humvees in those early days of 2005 and 6. And we solved that problem, and then we got MRAPs, and then, you know, so I mean, the institution, in relative light speed to the way the government works, really did come, and that's where I realized that that's where I sort of built that idea that men and women of character make the difference. Okay, I've overstayed my welcome. I didn't get long, and I didn't get a bell.